Hello chess fans, today I'm going to be starting a new series on the Catalan, and the variation that I'm going to discuss today is the closed Catalan. So without wasting any time, let's get into it. After d4, knight to f6, c4, e6. Here white plays this move g3, and this is the beginning of the Catalan. Now, this opening can happen from a couple of different move orders. For example, what I just showed you on the board, a knight f6 e6 is one of the move orders that it can arise from, but it can also start with d4 d5, pawn to c4, and after pawn to e6, knight f3, knight to f6. This is something that can also happen. Now, let's go back. Let me quickly open up this. And after d5 here, this pretty much transposes. Here, white plays bishop to g2. Now, you can play knight f3 instead as well, and this is playable. However, a lot of lines, in a lot of lines, it's better to start with g3, bishop g2, just because it avoids certain moves. For example, here, already in this position, instead of g3, you can start with knight to f3 and then play g3, bishop g2. However, this allows queen's Indian, for example, with b6 and bishop to b7. And you can avoid this with g3, but then g3 allows some various different lines with c5, and you can still go into some Benoni lines here, but it's not like the best version of Benoni. But this is not something that I want to get into right now. But the move order that I would specifically recommend here is pawn to g3, and then putting the bishop on g2, and then putting the knight on f3. Okay, so here d5 is played by black, and bishop g2 is played by white, bishop e7, knight to f3, and castles. Now, if this was the open Catalan, here black would take. Black would take, white would play knight to f3, and here there are many continuations. We will discuss these in a separate video. But here, in the closed Catalan, black never takes and instead puts the pawn on c6 and tries to slowly break out with b6, bishop b7, and c5. That is the general plan for black. So let's say bishop to e7, knight to f3, castles, castles, and now we get to this position. Now, in my opinion, there are three different ways of playing closed Catalan with black. One of them is putting the bishop on e7. One of them is putting the bishop on d6. You have to play c6 first and then put the bishop on d6. So c6 and putting the bishop to d6. Or this bishop will give a check on b4. And these are all different ways of playing. I will start with bishop to e7, and I will discuss all three of these. So after bishop to d7 and after bishop e7 in this position, castles, castles, here black plays c6. Black gets this solid pyramid here that he wants to achieve. And the idea that you have to remember here as white is what you're trying to do is you're trying to execute e4. And right now, this square is way too well defended for black. However, we can put pieces on certain squares and start controlling this square on e4. And the moves that I'm talking about are queen to c2 and then knight to d2. So let me show you. After queen c2 right here, let's say black plays knight b d7. Here we play knight d2. Now, you don't generally want to play knight to c3 in Catalan. There are some lines where you can play knight c3, and it is the best move, but those are rare. And you want to put the knight on d2 because you are also still defending the pawn on c4 and you're preparing e4 regardless. So this is why you want to get this setup. You want to put the queen on c2 and you want to put the b knight on d2 and play e4. This is the plan. So if black allows this, for example, if black plays b6, white plays e4, here a common mistake that people make is d takes e4. This is what I've seen a lot of even higher rated players do quite often, is they take on e4 in this position, and after knight e4, queen e4, bishop to b7, defending the pawn, preparing knight to f6. rook d1 is played by white, and knight to f6, and here you can retreat queen to e2 or c2, and they're both equally as good. I've played both of them, but the one that I prefer is c2 because it's a bit more aggressive, like knight g5, and you have some pressure on the diagonal. You're also supporting c5 in some positions. You're also potentially playing queen a4 in some other positions as well. So my preferred choice is c2 and not e2. However, e2 is playable as well. The benefit of e2 is that there's pressure on the e file. For example, in some positions, c5 is played by black, d5 is played by white, and then this queen on e2 has pressure on this bishop. However, this can easily be negated, in my opinion, and I think the queen on c2 is a better square for the queen. So here, queen c2, queen c8, you play this idea c5, the queen on c2 defends this, and the idea is to block in this bishop, so you're not allowing black to play c5 himself. And this does look weakening, and to some degree it is, because you are giving this square to your opponent. However, you are going to play around this because you're going to control b4, and if the knight lands on d5, let's say, you are basically controlling all the squares that the knight can jump into once you play a3, of course. b4 is the only square that we're not controlling right now, and this position is quite good for the white pieces. Let me quickly check what's the evaluation for this. Yeah, it's +1 for white. After a move like bishop g5, even a3, it's +0.9. So as you can see, white has a very pleasant game here. Now going back, there are two ways to play that are acceptable, in my opinion, after e4, and those are bishop to b7, which allows e5, or taking on c4. I will discuss both. So let's say bishop to b7 first. After bishop to b7, white plays e5, knight goes back to e8, and here this might look super unpleasant for black, but it really is somewhat playable. White is going to be slightly better. Here, white exchanges. Both captures are sort of playable. I do think, I guess e takes gives you more play, but it's also a bit more dangerous. C takes is more stable. So let's just consider c takes here for the argument's sake. Here we play rook to e1. Very important move, because this structure right here, we are anticipating that our opponent is going to play f6 to challenge our structure, and the rook on e1 will hit this pawn on e6. Once f6 happens, this pawn is under tremendous amount of pressure. Another idea here, after a move like f6, if we don't win the pawn immediately, there are various ideas of bishop h3 here, further attacking this pawn. There might be some better moves here though, like probably knight g5, hitting this and this is better, but I'm just talking from a conceptual standpoint. This is one of the major ideas in these sorts of positions, and not even if they play f6, you're going to see in a little bit after rook c8 here, let's say queen d1 is playable, queen d3 is playable, let's just say queen d3 just for the argument's sake, knight c7. Here what you want to do, your idea to create an attack on the king is to play h4, and let me just show you. I'm going to make a couple of bad moves by black. Let's just say a6. Your idea is to play knight to h2, the other knight to f3, and then put this knight on g4, this knight on g5 potentially. If opponent plays h6, then you have sacrifices on h6 and try to eviscerate the king. So that's your idea. You want to play h4. Let me go back. You want to play h4. You want to put this knight on h2, the other knight on f3, and bring the h2 knight to g4 and start a massive attack on the king. And these positions, if played perfectly, they should be a draw, but it's slightly better for white, generally speaking. So that's it for this variation right here. You can also play a move like queen d1. I'll just show one more line. And after queen c7, knight b1 to reroute back to c3. And then that is what you do. And then you execute similar plans but with this knight being on c3, you can debate whether this variation is better than the other one. The engine seems to think so. Practically, though, I think the other variation might be more dangerous to play against for black, but you can choose and decide which line you like. Okay, so going back, what a black can do instead of playing bishop b7 as well is he can take on c4, and here again you can do many different things here. This is probably the most flexible line because there's just so many ways to set up the position for white, but the best plan that puts the most pressure is probably bishop g5, and the idea here is that you basically want to play e5, and if white captures on g5, after knight g5 you have tremendous amount of pressure on h7. This knight on f6 cannot move because then black would get checkmated here, so that knight has to stay there, and if black tries a move like a knight to d5, you can always exchange on e7, and now that the dark square bishop is gone, this square on d6 is quite weak, so you can just play knight d6. Black has to move this bishop or defend it, and then you can continue developing your rooks, finishing your development, and you can enjoy a slight advantage. So that is what I think, but the advantage is very tiny, though it's not anything crazy, but you do have a very small edge. Okay, I think that's it for bishop e7 lines. I don't think there's anything else that I wanted to mention now that I'm looking at this. No. Okay, let's move on now. So now we're going to talk about when black puts the bishop on d6 and tries to play for quick e5. So in this move order, bishop d6 immediately is not good because you can debatably be kicked out with c5 here, and the position is quite pleasant for white, like c5, bishop e7, and then maybe bishop f4. It's arguable. Let me quickly check. No, it's not the best way to play, but actually, yeah, you can probably start with this move order if you're playing with black, because if c5 doesn't work, then you're going to play c6 next move, so it doesn't matter. But you just have to watch out for some various c5 lines with the black pieces. So if you play this with black, be careful here. Here, let's say black plays c6 and then puts the bishop on d6. Now, the idea here is that what black wants to do is put this knight on d7, of course, and play for quick e5. And after white castles, black castles, here we play our regular move, queen c2. First, you generally want to develop the queen, and then you want to develop this b knight. Let's say white plays knight to d7, and here we play knight to d2, preparing our e4 pawn push, and here opponent plays rook e8, preparing e5 himself. And now we should not play e4 right away here, because if we play e4 after black takes, we take. Black gets this e5 move very quickly, so he executes his plan, and here there is pretty much no advantage. We can continue developing with like bishop g5, f6, bishop goes back, takes, knight to e5. These positions are equal. I don't see any advantage for white, but you can try to play these if you want to, but I would recommend a different move. So going back, because the bishop is placed on d6, we don't have to rush with e4. We can actually start with b3, and b3 is just a normal developing move. We want to put the bishop on b2, and here the idea is that if black executes his normal plan with e5, which he wants to execute, we want to take c takes d5 first. We don't take the e pawn, we start by taking the c pawn. Why? It's because this forces our opponent to make a very uncomfortable decision. If our opponent takes with the pawn, which I think is the best move, it's not good to take with the knight, and now we'll show you why. After c takes d5, we take this pawn, and then we go bishop to b2, and here we are playing against this isolated pawn on d5, which is playable here, but there's only one good move in my opinion, and that's to go back with the knight and just simply avoid trading pieces for black, which, you know, it's, if you are playing against lower rated players, they're not gonna go back with the knight. I mean, come on. If you're playing against someone who is very strong, they might find this move. But if they simply just capture on f3, you take back, and your idea is to just continue developing queen d, put the queen on d3 at some point, maybe not immediately, put the rook on d1, pressure this pawn tremendously. That is your plan. Put this pawn on e3 just to solidify it, and you have a very pleasant position with a slight advantage once again. So going back, here, if black captures with the knight instead of capturing with the pawn, now we have knight c4, and now you can see the weakness of placing this bishop on d6. If our opponent captures with the knight, he gives up this square on c4, and after a knight c4, bishop c7, here we can start exchanging. And here the advantage is that we're going to take the knight, we're going to take the bishop, and we're going to have this monstrous bishop on b2, basically cutting this entire diagonal off, and we just have a very strong piece. So our light square bishop is much stronger than our opponent's light square bishop, and our dark square bishop is also stronger than our opponent's knight. Debatably, but I would say it is slightly better than this knight. It's you know, slicing through the entire diagonal here. So I think this position is very pleasant for the white pieces. So we have an advantage here. You could also technically consider e4, but I would just take the pawn on e5, and this is a good position. Now let's move on to the next variation that I want to show you. So let me go here. So right here, yeah, so bishop to b4. So we discussed bishop e7, we discussed bishop d6 lines, and now let's discuss what I think is the best move by black, and also the most complicated in my opinion, and that is bishop to b4 check. Now, what is the idea of bishop to b4? Here, white can block in three different ways. White can block with the knight on c3, or with the knight on d2, or with the bishop on d2. If white blocks with the knight on c3, this actually transposes into some lines with nimzo-indian, and I have actually already shown this variation on this channel in my nimzo-indian series, but with a different move order. In that move order, you know, it was a normal nimzo move order, and then later on white plays g3 and then bishop on g2. I will show this line one more time. Here, black castles, knight to f3, black takes on c4, takes on c3, and then plays this move c5, and the position is equal. So takes, knight c6, giving back this pawn on c4 and getting some development. This is also the same variation where Magnus Carlsen accused Hans Niemann of cheating. This was that line, like this was the line when that happened. Okay, so this is how you play this position with white and black. It's going to end up being equal if both sides know what they're doing, and I don't think knight c3, knight blocking on c3 is the best way to block for the white pieces. Now let's discuss bishop to d2. Now here, if white blocks with bishop d2, you do not want to take this bishop. Okay, you do not want to take this bishop. You actually want to retreat this bishop back to e7. Now, why is this good for black, and what does this do? In previous lines that I showed you earlier in this video, the knight usually ended up on the d2 square while the bishop was still on c1. And in this line, because the bishop is occupying the d2 square and the knight cannot go there, this is an improvement for black, because this bishop usually wants to stay on c1 and it wants to be developed later on. However, since black forced white to block with the dark square bishop. Here white has to make one more move with this bishop. Usually it goes to f4 and then put the knight on d2, which loses time. And also putting the knight on c3 is somewhat dangerous once again, because black might take and then play c6, b5 and try to get away with the pawn. It's playable though, for sure. Knight c3, I'm not saying that this is not playable. This is for sure playable, but the idea is that we are misplacing this bishop on d2, and we are asking white to waste it. We're forcing white to waste the tempo pretty much. If we look at this from the black's perspective, white has to move this bishop again. Okay, so here we continue with knight to f3. Black plays c6, so once again not taking on c4, and castles, knight d7, queen c2. Now, one more detail that I want to mention is if you're playing this from the black side, and you give this check on b4 and then go back, you don't want to take on c4, because the whole advantage of this check, giving this check on b4 and going back, is the fact that you're misplacing this bishop. And if you open up this position in a lot of lines, this will be counterproductive, because this bishop on being on d2 might actually help out white. In some lines, let me show you here. In some lines, if black decides to take here, white can go queen c2, and there are some possible variations where in some lines this bishop goes to a5 to pin this pawn, provided this pawn is already on b5, this is on a6, and this bishop is on a5 and it's quite strong. So for example, let's say a6 here. It doesn't work in this line exactly, but like something like this, bishop to b7. And here there are various lines with bishop a5. This is what I wanted to show. Like there are some lines where this bishop might go to a5, pinning this pawn. Black doesn't get c5, and it is a very uncomfortable position for him. So you don't necessarily, we will talk about those sorts of lines, open Catalan lines, in a different video, but that's just a detail that I wanted to mention. If you're playing this from the black side, you give this check, you go back, you do not want to take on c4. Okay, so knight d7 is played by black, queen c2, castles, rook d1. This is just a normal line. Black plays this a normal idea, b6, bishop b7, and then c5, and here bishop to f4. And then this knight to e5. This is the theoretical continuation here. You don't have to remember this position in this much detail, but something like this can happen. And then this knight goes to c6, winning the dark square. Not winning the bishop, but exchanging the knight for a bishop. But the position still remains in the balance. We get a very symmetrical structure. And this should be equal for black. Black is equalizing. It's going to be a bit uncomfortable for black to hold this, but it is definitely a drawn position if played precisely. Okay, so that is it for blocking with the bishop. So if you play bishop b4 check, just to summarize, and then go back to e7, if your opponent blocks with the bishop, you're getting normal bishop e7 lines, but with an improvement. And the improvement is that white played bishop to d2. There's another way to block in this position, of course, and that is knight on d2. And here, I think this is probably the trickiest one, in my opinion, for both sides. But it is definitely fine for black. After black castles, white plays knight f3. Black can play in different ways. The most played move here is b6. However, d takes c4 and b5 is also playable, trying to take advantage of this pin because the knight cannot recapture. But b6 is the main move. Castles, bishop to b7, and now position goes something like this. Knight e5, trying to take advantage of this pin. Now black cannot capture on c4, a5, a3. Now we don't even exchange anymore because we don't want to give white the two bishops. I'm saying we as if I'm looking at this from white's perspective right now, but I play Catalan from both sides, white and black, so I want to, I know all of these lines from both sides. So bishop e7, b3, and we get a very sharp position. Black goes back, plays c5, and these positions should be equal for black if black once again knows what he's doing. However, if black gives this check on b4 and white blocks with the knight, and then he goes back regardless, now this is really bad for black. This is going to backfire because after knight f3, I'd say castles, c6, queen c2. Now, instead of being down a tempo, we are actually up a tempo with the white pieces, and we are executing e4 one move faster. So knight d7, we are executing e4 right away. Black has not played b6 in this line because black wasted a move here and then went back. If the knight blocks, you don't want to give this check on b4 as black and then go back. You stay on b4. Sometimes you capture, sometimes you go back later on, but you don't want to go back right away. You want to go b6, bishop b7, or you want to take on c4. This line is also playable, like queen c2, and here c5 is very strong for the black pieces. It's equal. I'm saying very strong, but when I say that, I mean that the position has been equalized by black. So that is it for the closed Catalan. Just to quickly summarize here, black has three main ways to set up, and they involve this bishop mainly: bishop e7, bishop d6, or bishop to b4. In my opinion, the best move is bishop to b4. However, this is also the most complicated. If black gives you this check on b4, you can consider both bishop d2 or knight d2. I've played both. I mostly play bishop d2, but I have played both, and this is playable from both sides. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Follow-up episodes are going to come out very soon. If you liked, like the video and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Have a great day and goodbye.